Okay, well, welcome everyone. What a great turnout. It's obvious this is a very hot topic, for sure. And for those that don't know me, I am Laurel Delaney. I'm the president and founder of Women Entrepreneurs Grow Global. And we are a nonprofit organization that educates women business owners and entrepreneurs and helping them expand their businesses globally. So this is a topic right up our alley as well. So I am delighted to be here and actually be your host and moderating today. And we are joined by Joe Maher, which we're very pleased and honored to have you, Joe, with us today. And also Ella Baio, who's both Ella and Joe are with Nixon Peabody. And what I would like to do when I have the tendency, I move it really, really quick, and I'm really thinking this through. And that is before we officially get started, I want to make sure if everyone can take their, rename, put their name and their company up on for the Zoom call, that would be great. It just gives a better identification for who's on the call. So you see, I have Laurel Delaney and my company up there. So that would be great if we can do that just for a second. And then I would like to share my screen. I'm going to share so that we have, let me see if I have Ella up here first, because I want everyone to get acclimated and become familiar with Ella and what she does. What is important for all of you to know is that Ella represents Women Entrepreneurs Grow Global through Nixon Peabody, her and her team. And they've been with us for a number of years. And Ella also serves on our WEGG board. So without further ado, Ella, I'd like for you to sort of mention what you do, and then if you'd be kind enough to introduce Joe, that would be excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Laurel.
Uh-huh.
So as Laurel said, I am an attorney, a partner at Nixon Peabody. I focus on trademarks and patents and some copyrights as well. Um, and that ranges that runs the gamut really from clearance work, filing patent and trademark applications, the whole process to get registrations and patents issued, some enforcement, some monitoring, general counseling, things like that. Our firm also handles litigation, but when it gets heavy into litigation, I usually pass it along to someone who's much better at it than I am.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that most of the questions for this call have more to do with my partner, Joe. But I'm here if anyone has any questions about intellectual property or any other really business needs that you might have. Our firm is general practice. So I can almost assure you that whatever business needs you may have, we have the right person to help you with it. So without further ado, I will pass it along to Joe.
And yeah, and then Joe, when we're passing it over to you, I just want to make sure everyone knows why we're here. Joe, you for sure know why we're here. And that is really, how do we minimize the effects of the Trump tariffs? We realize that we have considerable uncertainty. So we have a lot of women business owners on the call right now, and many of them are actually inventors as well. So we just really want to know how to get our ducks in a row and how to have plan A, B, C, D once Trump becomes president of the United States and day one, all of this is going to happen with the tariffs. At least that's what we assume. So we'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurel, so much for having me and for Ella for inviting me as well. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you guys. I'm going to try to share my screen. And so let me see if this will work here. All right. Is that working? You guys see my?
Not yet.
Okay.
There you go. It's coming up now, Joe.
Okay.
There you go. You got it.
Okay. Great. Um, so just to give you a little bit of my own background, before I went to law school, I was an engineer. Worked in the Chicago area for a company designing different materials. I'm a material science engineer. Then I went to law school, worked for a judge, then a law firm in Chicago for a while. And then after 9/11 happened, I came out to Washington, D.C. to work for the Department of Homeland Security. And I ended up working there for about 20 years in a number of different capacities, heading up their legal regulatory program. And then I eventually became the most senior career attorney at the department, overseeing about 2,000 attorneys throughout the department. I was the acting general counsel there for a number of years. And one of the offices that I oversaw was the legal office that gives legal advice to Customs and Border Protection. And so I don't know how familiar you guys are with that agency, but Customs and Border Protection is the agency that actually implements and enforces customs duties, tariffs, things like that. So that's kind of my background experience is more on the government side. I worked with them. Came over to Nixon Peabody a little less than a year ago and have done customs work in the private sector as well. But my kind of bulk of my experience is from the government side of doing work related to customs issues. So kind of the first question I think is obviously is there's a lot of talk about tariffs. Is this a real threat? And I think clearly the answer is yes to that. Let's see, I'm through my slide. There it is. So this is a quote from President Trump, incoming President Trump, less than a week ago when he was interviewed on Meet the Press. He just says, "I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful." So not only is he saying that now, but in his first term, he was very active on the tariff front, doing a lot of things that some were clearly kind of spelled out and had been done previously in previous administrations. Others were very much on the edge and pushed a lot of tariff authority. So I think this is definitely going to be an issue going forward for businesses. So what drives decision making on tariffs? One of the issues is economic reciprocity. So to the extent the president thinks that other countries are being fair with us in their trade practices or unfair with us, that may drive decision making on tariffs. One of the things that President Trump has said is he really wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And so by restricting or kind of imposing higher costs for imports, that's a means for him to try to do that. The overall trade deficit of the United States, which has grown over the years, is a concern that he's expressed a lot of concern about. National security issues. So if there are certain industries within the United States that are threatened to be going out of business or can't be sustained, and those industries produce goods or materials that are essential for our national security, that's another aspect. Kind of a catch-all, other geopolitical issues, other things, other relations we have with other countries that may not be economic in nature have also caused him to threaten tariffs. So one example is immigration issues. So, especially when this comes to Mexico, he's threatened tariffs if Mexico won't take certain actions to assist in stemming the flow of migrants from Mexico and Central America, really, into the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about an example on that later. But I think the bottom line is it's very difficult to predict where kind of new President Trump will decide to impose tariffs, how much they'll be imposed, whether they'll be some type of an across-the-board tariff or country-specific. And we'll talk a little bit about the different legal authorities that he has, and some of those legal authorities are tailored in certain ways. But overall, I think it's generally going to be pretty difficult to predict ahead of time where he's going to go with which types of tariffs. So just to talk a little bit about the legal authority for tariffs. So the primary authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations is given to the Congress by our Constitution. So the Constitution says in Article 1 that the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, which is what tariffs are, imposts and excises, to pay the debts and provide the common defense and general welfare of the United States. And so it also says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So for the balance of our history in our country, Congress has clearly been the one that has the authority to set duties or tariffs that have to be paid when there are imports from other countries. And there are a number of statutes throughout our history that actually do that. The president, however, of course, is the one who has the power alone to speak on behalf of the United States when negotiating with other countries. So it's really a kind of a shared balance between the Congress and the president in terms of setting economic policy with other countries. That trend has been to give the president much more authority in recent decades to do this in ways that don't require certain congressional action. There's been no kind of court that's recognized an inherent ability of the president to just go out and issue tariffs at whatever country he wants or whatever amount he wants without having some other type of either delegated authority from Congress or something like that. So he doesn't have a totally free hand to just go out and impose tariffs whenever and wherever he would like. Um, uh, so I want to talk about some of the key statutes that do delegate authority to the president are ones that he's used before and he'll likely use again. So the first one, and even though these are embedded in different statutes, they're usually referred to by the section that they're affiliated with within that statute. So when you hear about Section 301 tariffs, that's from the Trade Act of 1974. And that statute basically gives the president authority to conduct an investigation into whether a particular country is engaging in unfair or unreasonable trade practices with the United States. And if they are engaging in those type of practices, then it gives the president authority to take certain trade actions to essentially retaliate for that. What it requires is a detailed findings and investigation by the International Trade Commission. So President Trump did this when he first came into office the last time in 2017. He instructed that there be an investigation of China's trade practices. An investigation was conducted over a course of several months, and they concluded that China did have negative and nefarious trade practices with the United States. And that opened his ability under Section 301 to impose tariffs on a number of different products. And so the way he did it is he had lists of products that they would put out that imposed varying tariffs from China. When you act under Section 301 for tariffs, it's usually imposed country specific. So the investigation is into a certain country's practices. And then in theory, the tariffs that are imposed, if there are bad practices by the country, are supposed to match and try to ameliorate those practices. We'll talk a little bit later about kind of the response from China or a country that receives those kind of tariffs. But that also, involves things that impose costs on companies doing business across the border as well. The second significant authority he has is under the Trade Expansion Act. And these are called Section 232 tariffs. These are based on national security. So the president has the authority to take actions to protect domestic industries vital to U.S. national security when they're threatened by imports. Under this is a very kind of tried and true method for the president to impose tariffs. The Supreme Court has approved this method as a way that gives the president authority to enhance tariffs against a country or related to an industry to protect the United States industry for national security purposes. So an example of this is where tariffs were imposed for aluminum and steel into the United States. That was designed to protect the United States national security interest in having a robust domestic steel and aluminum producing capacity. The way this happens under this statute is a little bit similar to the one I just mentioned under Section 301. There's an investigation that first happens, this time by the Department of Commerce, into the national security effects of a particular industry that's being harmed by imports. Then that report is given to the president. The president decides what types of tariffs to impose. it's not just tariffs that the president can impose on this. He can also impose quotas. So he can just limit the amount or the number of tonnage of things coming into the United States. So there's flexibility there. This was an authority, though, that was rarely used before 2018, before President Trump first did it for steel and aluminum products. It had been used before, but very rarely. When he did this, sorry, someone have a question? Okay, I'll also take questions at the end too. I'm glad to engage in questions and answer anything you have. But when President Trump imposed these tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018, it spawned counter tariffs from China and others. The EU imposed 25% retaliatory tariff on American whiskey. So usually when the response from other countries comes, it's not necessarily on the same type of goods. They'll usually try to pick some type of good that is important to the U.S. export market and tailor it in that way. President Biden has also continued the use of this authority. So this is not just President Trump that's done this. Biden has used this authority and also used it in his negotiating with other countries over trade and duty rates. This one, kind of one of the differences between this one and the one I mentioned before, 301, is it's not country specific. So it can apply, can result in tariffs being imposed for goods, whatever country they come from. And then the last one I'll mention here is more controversial. It's when the president invokes the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. This one has not actually there have not been tariffs implemented under this statute before, although President Trump did threaten them against Mexico, threatened to use this against Mexico, basically to strong arm Mexico into some of his immigration policies that he wanted to implement. So if anybody's familiar with something that was called the Remain in Mexico program, which is an immigration program policy that was implemented by President Trump in his first term, that basically said if a migrant is coming to the United States from Mexico, usually from originating from another Central American country, claiming asylum, that is, they've claimed they were persecuted in their home country. Under the Remain in Mexico program, the United States can basically push those people to stay in Mexico pending their asylum claims. So usually when people come into our southern border, claim asylum, they come into the United States, they're able to stay as a general matter until their asylum claim is adjudicated and a judge decides, yes, you either do qualify for asylum, you can stay, or no, you don't, and you're removed. That process can take multiple years. And so under President Trump's immigration program for this, those years were spent in Mexico under the Remain in Mexico program, rather than allowing people to stay in the United States. This is an important program to him because it has a deterrent effect for people coming, because if they know they're going to come but have to sit on the border in Mexico for several years, it makes it a lot less attractive for them to make the trek up. But anyway, to implement that program, he needed Mexico's approval. The United States can't just force people into another country without that country's approval. And so initially, Mexico was not keen about that idea, but through negotiations, including threats to use IEPA and impose tariffs, Mexico relented and did allow that program so that the migrants could basically be put into Mexico. After they agreed to that, President Trump kind of withdrew his threat to impose tariffs under the statute. This use of it is controversial in part because the statute itself doesn't specifically mention giving tariff authority to the president. The statute basically says that if the president declares an emergency, then he can regulate any transfer of any property in which any foreign country or national thereof has an interest. So typically people think of this authority as it relates to trade being used in times of war, for example. If we're at war with another country, the president can basically stop shipments of imports from that country, or types of shipments from that country. So using it to impose tariffs in a non-war situation is pretty unique. That said, the president usually has wide latitude in both describing that we're in a war with a particular country, but also that an emergency exists for the United States. And so it wouldn't shock anybody if President Trump comes in and declares there's an emergency on our southern border because of the migrant flow. And so that's going to trigger my use of IEPA. So that's another one to watch out for. If he does use it this way, he will undoubtedly claim that it gives him wide latitude. So in terms of imposing tariffs on Mexico, it could be targeted towards particular industries, or it could be an across the board, tariff imposition on all goods coming from Mexico at a certain percentage. So, one possibility in the way I think President Trump has operated in the past, sometimes too, is to, kind of threaten to use this huge hammer and then use that as a negotiating tactic. And if he gets what he wants, you're relenting. If he doesn't, though, then following through. So, that's another authority, and those are the primary authorities that I think have either been used in the past or likely to be used kind of in the near term with the president coming in. One thing that's kind of lurking in the background that I'll mention, and this kind of gets into the more legal nitty-gritty, but it's something called the non-delegation doctrine. So this is a legal idea that when the Constitution gives Congress authority, as Congress clearly has to set tariffs, it can't just delegate all of its authority to the executive branch. So when the Constitution assigns a responsibility or activity to Congress, Congress basically has to carry it out. It's unclear how courts will react if there's a non-delegation argument made about the president's use of any particular one of these. Those arguments have sometimes been made in the past and failed. Although I would say that outside of the trade context, this doctrine is gaining kind of more momentum because of the appointments that President Trump had to the Supreme Court have generally been much more receptive to non-delegation arguments in other contexts. So, so it's a possibility that will raise itself as well. So, which is all to say that some ways of imposing tariffs are kind of tried and true, and he can clearly impose them. Usually, those ways take more time because they do require investigations to make sure that there are unreasonable tactics being imposed by other countries or a real threat to national security. The ones that are kind of more immediate that you can impose are the ones that tend to be a little more controversial. You could see more litigation over those. So kind of talking about where the legal checks on the imposition of tariffs. So the non-delegation doctrine is one that I talked about. People could bring lawsuits and say, actually the president doesn't have this authority to do what he just did. That's Congress's authority. And so if we want to have tariffs imposed in a certain way, Congress needs to pass a statute that does that. It can't just be the president acting unilaterally. So that's one aspect. Congress itself, of course, can pass a statute. So if the president imposes tariffs on day one in some way, Congress can enact a statute that's either reverses his imposition of tariffs or changes it in some way. Now, I think the prospects of that are very, very low in the near term, certainly within the next couple of years, for a number of reasons. One, because Republicans are going to control both houses of Congress. And so it'll be unlikely that President Trump's own party will buck him and try to pass a law that kind of rebukes his tariff use of a tariff authority. Two, to get a law enacted, you would also need to override the veto of the president, and presumably President Trump would veto a bill that tried to reverse his tariff policy. So Congress has the ability to change and kind of pull back on Trump's tariff authority, but unlikely in my view. Traditionally, the World Trade Organization is also another place where other countries can go if they think the president has overreached on tariffs. And the United States, as a party to the World Trade Organization, was part of one of the key countries that kind of built and implemented the World Trade Organization. And it has a mechanism. World Trade Organization really, in general terms, does two things. One, it provides a forum for countries to negotiate with each other to set their duty rates across the board for all the goods that get traded internationally. And it carries over from prior international agreements, GATT, kind of a most favored nation status. So the idea is that if you're a part of the World Trade Organization, then you're going to get the same duty rates imposed on you as every other country that's involved. So that's the general premise of it. There are exceptions that happen, and that's what sometimes allows tariffs to be imposed for national security reasons and other reasons. But that's the general premise. That's one thing that the World Trade Organization does. The second key thing that it does, it sets up a dispute mechanism. So if countries think, hey, the United States is imposing tariffs on us in a way that's inconsistent with the rules of the World Trade Organization, we want to dispute that. And so there's a dispute body within the World Trade Organization they can file litigation against the United States. And that has happened, I think, a couple hundred times since the World Trade Organization has existed. So what happens then is a country will file a claim saying, so China did this, for example, when President Trump imposed his 301 tariffs on China after he came in his first term. China basically said these tariffs are unfair. They're not based on anything that any legitimate reason under the World Trade Organization that allows him to impose these tariffs. And so they litigated that. The adjudicatory body within the WTO actually found against the United States and found that its tariffs were not consistent with the WTO rules and regulations. But what happens at that point is that then the case essentially gets appealed to an appellate body within the World Trade Organization. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the appellate body has to have a quorum of at least 3 judges that come from countries that are not part of the dispute. And then the appellate body decides whether kind of the lower body was correct in its conclusions. Right now, the WTO doesn't have enough judges to form a quorum. And the reason why it doesn't have enough judges to form a quorum is because the United States has prevented the appointment of new judges as the prior judges' terms ended. So the way judges are appointed in the appellate body for the WTO is by consensus. So the United States, starting with President Obama actually blocked one, but really starting with President Trump in his first term, has blocked every person who's been put up as a potential judge for this appellate body. And that, in effect, prevents the appellate body from adjudicating cases. And so what's the effect of that? Well, the effect of that is that the ruling from the lower body can't be enforced. And so it basically presents this basically a status quo situation where a country like China can't get its finding against the United States enforced. So that is something that I certainly don't see changing with the new Trump administration. My guess is the WTO will essentially stay unable to enforce its rules when a country comes to it and says the U.S. tariffs are inconsistent with our agreements under the WTO. And so that basically puts a huge check on the ability of other countries to do that. So what does that mean, though, practically? Practically, it means that other countries will basically take things into their own hands, impose retaliatory tariffs, other measures that basically counter what the U.S. has done. So this is obviously how you get into trade wars. So I think, that's going to be a likely consequence if there are significant tariffs imposed on other countries. They'll probably try to go through the WTO process, but they'll be stopped because there's no appellate body. And so they'll probably impose their own tariff restrictions and reciprocity with the U.S. And then finally, what you guys really want to know are kind of what are your options? How do you deal with this situation? if we do think that tariffs are coming, I would say at the outset, it's going to be very difficult to get around tariffs. So they're designed for a purpose, and there are mechanisms in place, enforcement mechanisms to ensure that companies don't evade them in unlawful ways. But there are a few things you can do, and some of these you may have already be familiar with. Some of them maybe not. One most obvious thing is stock up now. So to the extent you know that your company is going to need goods from certain countries that may be recipients of tariffs in the near future, to the extent you can purchase those now and bring those into the United States, that certainly avoids it. And really, as I'm thinking through it, if I was a business owner, the three countries I would be primarily concerned with would be China, Mexico, and Vietnam. And I say those three because those are the three countries with that the U.S. has its largest trade deficit of any countries in the world. And Trump has said that trade deficits are, one of the things he wants to reduce for the United States. Vietnam, the reason why that is in there, why Vietnam, you may not normally think of Vietnam as being, one of the top countries that the U.S. has a trade deficit with. But when tariffs were imposed on Chinese goods, a lot of that, I think, went to Vietnam to be manufactured. And so that caused a lot more import from Vietnam into the United States. So stock up now is one option. Another option is to use foreign trade zones. So foreign trade zones, if you're not familiar with those, there's a statute that sets up what are called foreign trade zones within the United States. They are geographic zones that are usually fairly close in geography to customs ports, where things come in from outside, from other countries. And they're basically a location where companies can hold material that they imported without paying any duties. So as long as the goods stay in the foreign trade zone, you don't have to pay any duties. Excuse me. And so you might ask, well, why do you want to do that? Just keep your goods there. One reason may be for storage. If you think the tariffs are going to be reduced at some point in the future before you actually need to use the goods, you could store them there. After they leave the foreign trade zone to come into the United States to be used, that's when they get the duty or the tariff imposed. So if you have it stored there today, but you're not going to actually use it for a year, and you think maybe a year from now the tariffs are going to be lower, that might be one reason you store it there. Another reason some companies use them is for exhibition. If you're bringing something in just to exhibit it, whether it's artwork or something else, maybe you have some type of good you're bringing in that's costly, you want to exhibit to your customers, even though they're not going to actually purchase that good. You can do that without having to pay the duty or tariff, as long as it stays in the foreign trade zone. Staging things until they're exported. So if you bring goods into the United States only to then export them to another country, you stage them in foreign trade zones, you don't have to pay the duties or tariff, because that's one of the conditions for setting these up, is that the duty only applies when the goods enter to be consumed inside the United States. So some of you may be, and I may be getting way in the weeds, but so I won't say more than a couple of words about this. Some of you may be familiar with what's called drawback in customs, which is basically if you bring goods into the United States and then turn around within a certain amount of time and just re-export them to another country, you'll have to pay duties when it comes in the United States, but you can go back to the customs officials and say, hey, I just exported this good without making changes to it, and they'll basically pay you back up to 99% of the duties that you had paid. So if you do that within a foreign trade zone, you don't have to pay any duties at all. You don't have to worry about drawback. You don't pay them when you bring it into the foreign trade zone, and then you can export it to whatever country you're exporting goods to. And then the final thing that I'll mention that happens within foreign trade zones is sometimes manufacturing or assembly of goods happens. So sometimes these foreign trade zones they're not small entities. You can have a whole, manufacturing facility within a foreign trade zone. So why would you do that? Well, you might do that if the tariff on a part is higher than the tariff would be on a completely assembled good brought in from outside the country. So, for example, if you're bringing in, a part of a device that you then manufacture in the United States to sell, and the tariff on that part is higher than it would cost than the tariff if you brought the entire good into the United States, you might use a foreign trade zone. So you just manufacture the good in the foreign trade zone. Then when you bring it in the United States to sell, you only pay the tariff on the assembled good, the finished product, as opposed to the tariff associated with the piece that you would have brought in initially. So foreign trade zones is one option to mitigate the effects of tariffs. Another option is what's called tariff engineering. So this is when you change the nature of the good that you're importing, because when you change the nature of the good that you're importing, it changes the customs classification of that item. That's a valid way of doing things, but it can get you in trouble. So I'll give you an example that played out in litigation, and this happened when I was within the Department of Homeland Security working for Customs. But Ford had a situation where they, for years, were importing vans into the United States. The tariff for vans changes significantly. If it's a passenger van that you import in the United States, the tariff rate is 2.5%. If it is a cargo van, the tariff rate is 25%. And so the way that Ford operated is they brought in their vans, but before they would release them into the United States, they brought them in as passenger vans. Before they released in the United States, they would tear out the seats of the van and basically just discard them and claim that these were actually now cargo vans. And once they got in the United States, so they would pay the 2.5%, bringing in the passenger vans. Once they got in the United States, they'd tear out the seats and sell them to the public as cargo vans. The U.S. government said, well, that's actually not valid tariff engineering. That's evading tariffs. And so they imposed a huge fine on Ford. It got litigated for quite a few years before it ended up settling for multiple hundreds of millions of dollars of non-paid tariffs. So I just mentioned that as a cautionary note that if you're going to do this, there is a valid way to do it, but you want to be careful and make sure that you don't kind of slip in from tariff engineering to tariff evasion, because the penalties are significant. But there are times when you can, maybe change the type of good that you're importing, and by changing the type of good, that may change dramatically the tariff amount that's applied. So that's another way you can mitigate that. And then the final way I'll mention on here is changing the country of origin. Obviously, if you can buy the same goods manufactured here in the U.S., you don't have to pay tariffs. Or if you can buy the same goods manufactured in a country where the tariffs aren't being imposed, that obviously changes the tariff landscape for you. So those are the kind of basic ways that I think you can try to mitigate that and change kind of the ultimate amount you pay on tariffs if and when they're imposed, except some of the legal background. But I'd be glad to kind of take any of your questions or answer any questions or kind of elaborate on any things I mentioned if it's helpful. But thank you very much, Laurel and Ella. I think you're muted, Laurel.
Yeah, thank you. But make sure that you make a note of Joe's email. And if you could do that quickly, just make sure everyone has that. And then, Joe, if you could then stop sharing your screen, but I want to make sure everyone has that email, just in case, okay? Just take a moment and then stop sharing your screen, Joe, because I'm the type of person I like to work the room. I like to see the faces when we do the Q&A here. So, okay, good. All right, we're good. Excellent. Oh, that's what I have to say. Outstanding, especially that last slide, foreign trade zones, the tariff engineering, giving us the case, an example with Ford, et cetera. But let's jump in. Connie, I noticed that you had a question in the chat box. So if you could unmute and if you could ask your question, I would appreciate it.
On Trump's Section 232 tariffs, because aluminum and steel both have long tariff codes. for a variety of changed, how it's changed in manufacturing, whether it's tubing or flat sheets or what, everything has its own code. Does section 232 require specific HS codes in order to be compliant?
Yeah, so when they actually impose the tariffs, they'll have specific HDUS codes they'll apply those to. And so when this is actually implemented, the customs officials, they'll just be able to look on the sheet to see kind of which classification it is, and they'll know exactly what the new tariff rate is for it. So yeah, so you're right. It depends on the type of steel or product it is, whether it's rolled and different things. So there are all different kinds of gradations, and he may or may not just apply it, to catch all those categories, or there may be some subcategories where they don't apply it, and that kind of leads to a point I didn't mention, which is a lot of times whether it's 301 or 232, the administration will often have a kind of advanced notice period where they say, here's what we're going to apply this to, and they'll allow public comments so the public can write in and say, hey, if you impose this on this type of good, it's going to have a real impact on my workforce, and I'm actually going to have to lay people off. So it allows the public to comment, them take into account that, and they may adjust the types of goods or types of codes that it applies to. And in fact, they did that. I know for the Section 301 tariffs, they did make adjustments between what they proposed and what they actually implemented tariffs for, based on some of that commentary. So that's another way that you could engage to try to mitigate some of the measures, is to engage in that kind of notice comments period with the government.
Which, Joe, also then has an effect of delaying the tariff implementation, right?
Right, if they go through that process, yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Connie, and thank you for the answer, Joe. Next question, Rana, if you could unmute and ask your question that you put in the chat box, please.
Thank you. I was trying to unmute, but it wasn't working. Thank you so much for the information. This is very, very interesting. I have a twofold question. I have an invention which is patent pending. So I'm having a really difficult time actually finding the HS code for my tool, because so I don't know if there is a way to get some sort of ruling on that, to get what the HS code is. But I recently moved my product manufacturing from Taiwan to China because Taiwan was so much more expensive than China. It was basically double. And the people who wanted to do white labeling and those kind of things with me, they wanted that really lower price per unit, which I needed to kind of be able to accommodate that. And the only place I could do that was China. And now I'm in China, and now I'm have this tariff hanging over my head. First of all, the question is, how long do you think it will take for this tariff to be implemented? Is there something that he can come to power and on day one, January 20th, we have tariffs?
He can try. I think, like I mentioned, the ones that would kind of be imposed immediately in some kind of across the board way for all products from a particular country, those would be more controversial and subject to legal challenge. So you might ask, well, who challenges that? It could be a country through the WTO process, but it could also be an importer who's injured and says, hey, this tariff's not lawful, I'm having to pay this tariff. There's a way you can challenge that through litigation, with customs, and then ultimately into U.S. courts. So that's one way you can challenge that if he does do that. That's a more risky way for the president to operate. So I'd be a little surprised if, I shouldn't say that because there's so many things I would say I'd be surprised that he's done in the past that I shouldn't be surprised anymore. But I think, if he wanted to pursue the most legally sound way of doing something like that, he will threaten, and he might say on day one, in 3 months or in 2 months, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then use the legal process to do that. So I'd be a little surprised if it was day one, boom, 50% tariffs and everything from China. I think that's probably unlikely. But to answer your other question too, about finding the right harmonized tariff code for that. I mean, there's basically kind of two ways you can do that. One is through a licensed customs broker. So licensed customs brokers are trained to kind of find the right harmonized tariff code for a particular item. If they say, we just don't know, this is such a novel invention, we just don't know, you can also go to CBP, Customs and Border Protection, write a letter to them describing what your item is. Sometimes you'll send in pictures, or you might even send a sample of it to them, and they will kind of respond and tell you what classification applies to that good. So usually you work with either a customs broker or a law firm to do that. But that way, that's the kind of most sure way that you get an answer is if you get CBP to tell you, here's what the classification code is for that. It can take a little bit of time, but usually they're pretty good about turning that around.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm an attorney myself, but I don't practice tariffs.
Yeah.
So I gotta talk to a specialist about this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Rana, for the question. It's a good one. And thank you, Joe. And moving on, Wendy, let's hear from you. If you want to state also your company, and I see you've got a question in the chat box, but go right ahead.
Yeah, my name is Wendy Chen. I'm import everything you need to celebrate, party, stationery, and holiday product. So right now, majority of products from China is 25%. So we expect it's going to go higher. Is any country that we can import still without tariff? Is any country in Asia or Europe or Africa? I mean, or is he going to tax all the country in the world? Is any country we still can go? And also, how about the product without tariff now? Like the product without tariff, toy, crafting, iPhone, some of the product without tariff now, is it going to be with tariff?
Yeah, I think it's hard to predict what he's going to do with certain items. I think it's unlikely he will impose a 25 or 50% tariff across the entire world. So if the goods you're bringing in, which are made in China right now, can be made in another country that doesn't have the same tariffs, I mean, that's certainly an option for you to do that. And really, kind of, that's something that can be found out pretty easily either through a customs broker or a law firm. But there are published, classification codes and tariff schedules that exist now that you could say, okay, if I have this good that I'm bringing in from China, I want to see if I want to bring it in from a certain country in Africa or another country, Mexico. You can look and see, okay, here's what the tariff is for that if I brought it in from that country. So that's something that's not hard to get. But I would be surprised if he, basically applied, hyper tariffs against the entire world. Just that would be that'd be
Crazy.
Cause a lot of retaliatory and damaging trade restrictions and tariffs against the United States. So.
Okay, thank you, Wendy, for your question. And let's move on. Candace, if you could unmute, introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Sure. Thanks, Laurel. Great presentation. Thank you, Joseph and Ella. So I'm Candace Tan, the founder of Infratel Worldwide. We're a global risk intelligence and investigations firm doing business in 160 countries. So I have 3 questions.
Oh.
They're all sort of slightly different focus. So the first is, how would you see the impact of tariffs being applied to US manufacturing, although I think you've answered quite a bit of that. The second would be, what would be the resulting impacts to international supply chains over the next few years? Because it does take years for manufacturing of goods to shift gears, finding new facilities, locations, facilities, checking that there isn't bribery and corruption in those countries, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a quick, you can't turn the ship quickly, is what I'm saying.
Right.
So I'm curious to hear your perspective on that. And if I might ask, the third one would be, Are there additional examples of national security issues that you might be aware of beyond, say, steel? Steel is the example you gave earlier, and
Sure.
obviously major impact.
Yeah. Well, just to take that last one first, I mean, another clear example are semiconductors. So the United States has imposed tariffs related to semiconductors, especially from China. That's, an area certainly I would say will continue. So I think a lot of, uh, um, you know, anywhere where the United States thinks it has to have a domestic capacity to produce things that are essential, especially for high tech related items, which is why I think semiconductors is an important one, steel is the other one, things like that. So that's what I would say for that. In terms of the impact on in general on manufacturing, I mean, certainly Trump's aim is to bring more manufacturing back to the United States to have it be cheaper for purchasers of goods to be able to purchase within the United States. We'll see if that happens. I'm not sure if it will or not. Clearly, I think it'll have an inflationary impact within the United States in general because this is going to clearly increase the cost of goods for importers. It also may increase there may be retaliatory tariffs that are applied against the United States, which increase the cost of goods around globally. In terms of its impact on supply chains, I think companies are much more aggressively now looking to diversify their sourcing and their supply chains. Clearly, I think it has had an impact on the U.S., including China, and their supply chains. Like I said, that's led to a benefit for some other countries in the region, like Vietnam and a few others. So I think that will continue because I think probably businesses who are thinking long term, this issue with China is not going to be resolved probably within the next 4 years, even if when Trump leaves office eventually. This is probably a long-term thing with China. So although that certainly doesn't mean all imports from China are going to go away, I do think that probably the long-term effect it'll be to shift it around to other parts of the world. And so kind of where that goes obviously depends a lot on the stability of the country you're coming from, the country's capability to generate the goods that you need, things like that. So yeah, so I think you're right. I think it will have an impact on supply chains globally.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great questions, Candace. Thank you. Julia, did you want to jump in or weigh in on through Widgeter and what you're doing managing the global supply chain? I don't know if you're doing something similar to what Joe just mentioned, diversifying.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, a lot of what we've been looking into is, changing our HTS codes if we need to, specifically for, HTS codes can be as specific as, for restaurants or for the home. And so we've kind of been noticing those differences and seeing what the different tariffs can be for us. One thing that we're looking at right now is duty drawbacks and what the risks are associated with those. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, actually, because we've heard that sometimes it can be more expensive to go into drawbacks versus just changing the HTS code and moving forward. I don't know if you have any other suggestions or advice.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So duty drawbacks are usually you can get the drawbacks when you do one of two things. One, you either export it to another country, the goods, or you destroy it within the United States. So if you bring something in the United States and you just don't need it anymore, and you can document that you destroyed it within the United States, you can get duty drawback for that. So one example of a client I had that did that was a client who had a bunch of clothing that they brought into the United States because it needed to be stored in the United States. And at the end of the day, they decided they didn't need the clothing for their purposes anymore. And so rather than kind of re-export it to another place where they could use it, they just decided to destroy it and get the drawback. So depending on how much the drawback is, that might affect what your choices are on that. So there are specific procedures you need to follow if you want to get drawback. You have to document things, and you have to carefully do that, because if you don't document it the right way and follow those procedures, they can deny you the drawback. So, so you're right. It is important to kind of make sure you're following, dotting your I's and crossing your T's when you're doing that.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you. Jules, can we hear from you, please, and your company and what you're doing? Because you precipitated having us do this call today. So it's good to see you, and please.
Yeah, thank you, Laurel. Thank you for
Yes.
hosting this.
Mhm.
There are a number of women on this call who are women inventors, and we
Mhm.
work closely with them in a mastermind group. And one of the things that we had talked about is that the challenge of US manufacturing, while I think if you asked all of us to a person, we would prefer to have US manufacturing done on our products. However, the challenge is that it's so expensive, even now with the less expensive workforce. But with Trump's other uh, primary focus of immigration, it will reduce significantly the amount of lower paid workforce that we have in the US. And so it almost feels a bit like we're in a double bind with his priorities. And that's more of a comment than a statement, but happy for you to comment on that, Joe, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. You're exactly right. I think his immigration policies will, uh, you know, provide fewer workers that otherwise would be here. I mean, unless he pairs it with a legislative loosening, statutory loosening of the restrictions on people who can lawfully come in. There has been some discussion of doing that before, and there have been bills in Congress that have done that before, where you basically bulk up on enforcement of unlawful migration, but also at the same time loosen the caps on people that can come in lawfully. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with immigration, generally there are caps on how many people can come in from certain countries lawfully. And so those are set by statute. But Congress could change those to allow more people to come in from certain countries to create a larger workforce. So whether that is likely to happen with this current Congress is you can guess about that. But you're right. I think you're right. It will provide can provide a double whammy on companies, because that workforce will be diminished if given what he's kind of talking about doing with immigration.
Okay, and do we have, Joe, do you have 2 or 3 more minutes?
Sure. Yep.
Okay, I actually have a question, and it's having to do with supplier contracts. Do you think it's wise that we work with the suppliers and, rework the contracts to determine who is going to absorb the additional costs if in fact tariffs are initiated? Is this a good time to be doing that?
Yeah, I think that's if your current contracts have you kind of bearing all the risk of increased tariffs, and and you think you can negotiate that to have the other side take it, I certainly think that would be a good idea. Or if there's a situation where you both don't want to have to absorb all that, you can negotiate so it's a shared burden that you share, as opposed to one party or the other kind of absorbing the full impact of them. So I think that's a good idea, to kind of generally review your contracts, see where you stand right now on that issue, and if you have the ability to negotiate that in a more favorable way, that's a smart thing to do.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else? Anything else that we're missing? I want to make sure before everyone exits the call that they don't jump off the call and think, God, I wish I would have gotten that one question in for Joe before we jumped. Anybody at all? Just you can wave your hand or. Okay, I think we're good to go. Joe, thank you so much. Invaluable information. Everybody, I can tell everybody's jazzed by it, and it just feels so much stronger and more confident now going forward. And Ella, thank you also for coordinating and working with us to make this happen. We appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today, for your participation and your engagement. And I guess that's it. And I wish everyone happy holidays. How does that sound?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Thank you so much.
facilitating, Laurel. And
Yeah.
thank you, Joe, and thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you. Happy holidays. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Ella.
Great questions.
Yeah, very good. And you handled all of the answers.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Joe already left. I was having technical issues, but
Yeah.
I was.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. Good question, too.